Well, that's also circumstances. My mother was not well at the time, and she was living in Jupiter. I convinced her to move to Miami, so she was living here, but she was sick all the time. And to keep coming from Jamaica, back and forth, back and forth. And also I'd hit some roadblocks in terms of my own career, which I won't go into because they're pretty negative, and I'd have to speak negatively about people who I've since made my peace with. But the whole thing coincided where she needed help and I needed to be here with her. So I moved here and I had some contacts here. I'd been doing some curating and collecting for Miami collectors in Caribbean art. And then I met Carol Damian through my friend Mel Destro, who was then the editor and publisher of Art News. And Carol asked me to teach at FIU, and that made a huge change in my life, because there were I started in the painting department, but it was pretty crowded, and there were too many people who wanted the job and wanted to have those positions. So she said, come into art history, come and teach in art history. She said, why don't you do a course in Caribbean art history? So I had to sit down and write a course in Caribbean art history. But because I'd been traveling all over the Caribbean, and every time I saw this astounding artwork, I'd also spent a lot of time in Cuba as part of all of my comings and goings and exhibiting and working with Caribbean artists. So I kept taking pictures. At the time it was slides. So I had this huge slide library. I didn't know why I did it, except that every time I see this stuff, I said, this is a knockout. This is fantastic. Somebody needs to know about this. So I had this large slide library and sat down and wrote the historical context to go with it. And I taught that course at FIU for 8 years. Oh, unlimited. I think there's something unique and powerful, and not the least of which, this is going to sound contradictory, has to do with the struggle. I mean, we live with that struggle every day in Jamaica, and you probably hear it epitomized in Bob Marley's music. But there is a colonial overlay and racial and social inequality and economic inequality, which is the legacy of slave trade, the sugar industry, and it bites into contemporary everyday society in ways that don't occur in the United States, except maybe in the Deep South, where there's still harm having been done by that kind of brutal era. But it's more like social inequality now and economic inequality that people are dealing with every day. My kids were born there, they grew up there, they've been immersed in this. I have had to change my thinking and my perspective on the world entirely as being a part of that society and being in sympathy with that society. I know you could say, okay, you could sit down and wait for all the foundations and the grants, and that's going to make a great artist. Let me tell you, during the state of emergency in Jamaica, I have never seen better art. People they didn't have materials, they didn't have safety, you couldn't go out at night, they had nothing to lose, and that all went into their artwork. And the power of the artwork during that era in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean, during their times of struggle, is far more powerful than anything that has been, coddled and carefully funded and, brought to fruition in some kind of gentle way. My work of the last 40 years has been very much involved with the climate period and environmental art. When I first went to Jamaica, the thought of painting a landscape seemed to me ultimately sappy. Oh, that's so corny, I would never do that. And then I started looking at the landscape and this great gift of nature. Also things that, the way the landscape was being abused, like by slash and burn agriculture, farmers who were using fire to clear large tracts of land instead of, cutting it down. So I started doing these vast landscapes that spoke about that. Also other things overlaid symbolism, like this red flower, a symbol of womanhood, beauty and power of womanhood. That was in the Jamaican exhibition that went to the Smithsonian, went to Washington. So that environmental consciousness began to evolve, but I kept painting the land and the land and the land. And also land is so significant in a post-colonial, post-slavery culture that the ownership and the maintenance of the land is vital. Land becomes much more significant than it would, agricultural land becomes much more significant than in an urban environment or a more evolved kind of economy. Anyway, so that became my obsession for a long time, documenting the land. And then when I came to Miami, first in 1999 to live and take care of my mother, I became much more aware of the sea. And I've been doing the land, but the sea is 3/4 of the planet, and it's a source of life. So then I started devoting a lot of my work to the sea and its conservation, its maintenance, its health, its beauty, and also its threat. South Florida is definitely under threat for sea level rise, and if you've lived in Miami any period of time, you see the water coming up.